Uh, it was better than it could have been. They might have tried to stick to their old rules. They might have tried to carry on cutting. It sounds inconceivable, but this government is quite capable of doing absolutely appalling things. And at least they tore those rules up. They may possibly have a small sense of guilt over having done so much austerity, having cut services back so much that when a crisis like this happens, we're not prepared.
Yeah.
But it's very hard to find evidence of guilt among this government, and but it was a start. When you begin to look at the detail, it's not so encouraging, but at least it was a start to realise that having one of the lowest public spending levels in Europe wasn't
exactly.
defensible. No, it isn't. But also, you can't expect them to suddenly learn in a few months about how to do things differently. It's not the instinct of this government. They were forced to do this. But in their heart of hearts, they would rather have a small state, cut back more, reduce taxes. And you saw evidence of some sort of reducing of taxes going on. It's just that the current crisis has forced them to actually behave like most normal people would behave, like most normal economic advisors across Europe would behave. And my worry is, my worry is it's temporary. That is what their instincts would be. That is what they have believed almost all their lives. That is what they've written in their blogs and what the books they read tell them. The question is whether the British public will change their view about what is right and proper, what matters most in life. Whether the British public begin to realise we can only test so many people because we only have so many labs. And they might ask, why do we have only so many labs? People might begin to ask, why do we have only so few intensive care beds? What happened to those? And there becomes a point when you cannot fool a general public anymore about what you have done. In the past, Conservatives changed their behaviour. After Churchill lost an election at the end of the war, it was a shock to the Conservatives. We had a spending Labour government that introduced the welfare state, and when the Conservatives came back into power, they copied it because the public mood had changed. And I'm hopeful that the public mood will have changed with this, and the idea that it's okay to scrimp and save on your health service and spend less on your health service than all the rest of Western Europe is just not acceptable.
Yeah. So riffing,
I think it has to be a break with austerity. Our formerly most profitable industry, the finance industry, is looking in an awful state at the moment as the stock markets plummet. The policy of trying to become an attractive place for the world's billionaires, that's part of the Brexit promise. It's not such a useful policy trying to attract in billionaires when they've lost a third of their wealth in a matter of a couple of weeks. It doesn't work. Worldwide, billionaires have lost a third of their wealth because so much of their wealth is held in stocks and shares. I mean, whether this is long lasting or not, we don't know. But we are in uncharted times. The price of gold has fallen. The price of gold normally rises when you have uncertainty. Bitcoins have crashed, which is very good because they were such a dangerous thing anyway. There is no safe haven for money. Wealth has reduced around the world for the wealthy. The flights have stopped, including their own private jet flights. They may try and do that, but increasingly people become suspicious of, why are you flying around the world in your private jet? We are entering a different kind of era, and at some point the fear and the scare will begin to transform to anger and questioning about, in whose interest is all this? Why is things arranged in this way? And it's at that point we should expect to see our politicians adapt to that, because they have adapted in the past. They may have their beliefs and their reasons for being politicians, but ultimately, and particularly Conservatives, they're survivors. They don't want to be completely out of fashion. So I do think this is absolutely the end of austerity.
Yeah.
Well, as yet it only goes half the way. As yet it makes some spending promises, which, if done well, would improve the lives of people who live average lives more than people who live rich lives.
Yeah.
But what they haven't done is increase the taxation on the well-off to pay for it. They've said they're going to borrow and endlessly borrow, and of course the people they borrow from will actually be the rich because they're the only people who've got the money, and they're going to borrow from the rich paying very low interest rates because we've slashed all our interest rates down. But borrowing from the rich at low interest rates is not quite the same as actually taxing the rich. That's the next step. And it's when you begin to tax the rich that you really see inequalities in income reduce and eventually inequalities in wealth reduce. And that's an anathema to them. They can't face the idea of taxing themselves and their friends. Well, I mean, it's all very sad. The first time we saw life expectancy fall for women, it became clear in February 2014, this is 6 years ago, that life expectancy for all women in England had fallen by 2 weeks. It fell more for poor women than for more affluent women. It is still now, the latest ONS recorded life expectancies for women and for men are below their level in 2014. Now, one ironic thing about what's happened is because life expectancy stalled and then fell slightly and certainly hasn't risen to where it should be, tens and tens of thousands of elderly, frail people in Britain have died early. And because they've died early, they're not around to die now. So you can contrast the UK with a country like Italy, which was doing a very good job at looking after its elderly, which meant it had a large elderly population and people were getting to 83, 84, 85 years of age. And so when the virus hits a place with many people who've been looked after, the effect is particularly devastating. Britain, ironically, has had a large number of premature deaths before the virus hit of its most frail. Life expectancy will almost certainly drop again, and then that will have to stop. And the question then is, do we carry on with this callous policy of underfunding care homes, of not having the kind of people you need to look after people who got Alzheimer's and dementia in care homes, of we halved the number of adult social workers, people who go and visit elderly people on their own who can't look after themselves. We're now trying to do big society. If you remember Cameron's failed policy, well, now there's a desperate, please can you go and provide your own welfare state to everybody? And hopefully people will help their friends and neighbours. But the problem is, if you look at the map of age, the elderly in Britain are concentrated around the coasts and in other areas away from the young and healthy. So the actual going and looking after your neighbours doesn't actually work so well in this case. But other than the USSR after 1989, there has been no other place in Europe, on the edge of Europe, which has had a slowdown and a fall in life expectancy like this. It will get worse this year. It almost certainly has to get better after that, but it will require a change in mindset and not seeing people as quite as expendable as this government has viewed them. And no other government in Europe has viewed people in the way that this government has. The easy solutions, and it makes a tiny difference, but are with infants. So England and Wales have seen a number of babies dying rise 2016, 2017, and then go flat 2018. In Scotland, they've reduced the numbers of babies dying dramatically over the same period. So Scotland's now got down to about 3.2 babies dying per thousand. It's a third of the way to becoming Scandinavian. The lowest rate in the world is in Finland. In England and Wales, we have had this increase, the only increase in Europe in infant mortality, the only increase for 2 or 3 years at any point since the Second World War. Scotland shows how a little bit of public spending and care can actually reverse that if you care. You also remember in Scotland they give child benefit for the third child. Remarkably, in England we decide that third children shouldn't be born. I mean, it's no child benefit. The harder thing is looking after an elderly population. Countries which do it well have a larger elderly population. The proportion of people who are elderly in Finland is much higher than in the UK because they look after their elderly. I mean, it's very, very sad. The USA has a low number of elderly people because it has such a terrible health service and such a terrible social security system.
Yeah.
And we have to get to a point of realizing if you do not have a society which cares for people, simply relying on people's families cannot be enough. It is not possible.
Yeah.
And you can't leave everybody to their own deserts. The thing I think which is most ironic about all of this is that to get to your late 70s or early 80s in Britain, you're much more likely to be middle class. You're actually quite likely to have voted Conservative in your middle age. And these are the people who are actually suffering the most. So it's a really kind of dog eat dog callousness. It's actually most affecting people who most loyally supported the kind of government that we have now, but in Margaret Thatcher's day.
In Margaret Thatcher's day, were able to buy their own houses essentially.
Some bought their own houses, but others got to pay their mortgage off in just 25 years and found themselves with a home worth $500,000, found they could have foreign holidays, found they could afford to send their children to private schools. You've got to remember private schools largely don't exist in the rest of Europe. It was kind of the I'm okay, John era. And often the children went away from where they are. Sometimes the children live and work abroad, and you have one elderly, often the mother, left in quite a nice little cottage somewhere in Surrey. No children in the country, no social services, no Meals on Wheels, no rural bus services, and COVID-19 sweeping across.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
social isolation.
Yeah, social isolation with the roses around the cottage and the lawn. Yeah, it won't do much at all. You could divide 1.8 billion by 600 odd constituencies, and then you can see how many million you have, and you very quickly work out you get a couple of streets of houses. But government could do a lot without spending money on housing. The biggest problem with housing in Britain isn't the need to build more. It is that we have more empty rooms in our houses than we've ever had before. We have more houses which are second or third homes, holiday homes. We have more houses with just one person living in them, with 4 bedrooms, in some cases 5 bedrooms. You need a way to encourage people not to occupy so much space, so that family homes are being occupied by single individuals. The kind of building you need, a building of very nice, high quality apartments that don't have stairs, which have a lift nearby to those family homes, so that people can actually downsize and move to something more appropriate, and also move into complexes where there are friends and neighbours actually around, rather than the very English, very conservative, very isolated. You get your detached house, you're on your own. Of course, about that, at the extreme in London, had been created in the 1970s by dividing the old houses of the aristocracy. So you had a whole series of apartments, have been recombined to make a giant house for a single family again. Complete, with numerous bathrooms that you can never use. And we have all those empty luxury, apartment blocks around the Thames. I mean, we have a lot of housing. We just don't have taxation mechanisms designed to really make it not worth people's while owning housing that is empty. We should tax people away from doing that. And of course, that would make the government money. The idea that, if you have a home that is empty and is empty for more than 6 months, the idea that you should get some rebate on your council tax because you haven't filled it. It should be the opposite.
Is there an existing rebate for council tax then for unoccupied homes? Is that the case?
Yeah, unoccupied, and also for one person. We actually encourage people not to be in. And we have a government policy, it's not explicitly stated, that says that housing should be as expensive as possible, because it shows the economy's working well if your house prices are high. Now, that's ridiculous from the point of view of people. But government tends to look at the price of housing rising and rising in London and says, well, it reflects salaries and wages. It just shows what a successful economy we are. That's their way of thinking, which is why you have tens of thousands of people sleeping rough on the streets. In the bottom end of the market in Oxford, we used to have bed-sit flats, which were pretty grotty, but if you fell out on your luck, that's where you ended up. Those bed-sit flats have now been done up and they're being rented out to very well-off postgraduate students for a fortune. There is nowhere left. So you can't simply solve homelessness just by spending money on the homeless. You have to make your whole housing system more efficient so that people are fitting themselves into houses with less waste. And that suddenly opens up a lot of space. There are places that need some building. There is some accommodation for people who are elderly that needs to be built. But our biggest problem is the amount of housing we have which is not occupied for a lot of the year. And that has risen and risen, particularly since around about 1991. We can measure it each census. And we've had this enormous rise in under-occupied housing.